have been studying this, and I really think this is talking about an office for women in the church. I've just not met many people are that way. The rest they're coming from the world has influenced me to think this way.
And it does go further, right?
All right, we are live audio-wise, so now be careful what you have to say. Well, and you, Brian, add one more category to that. If you have a husband whose wife is overly outspoken, when she pretty much runs the family of sorts, I can see that scenario being like what you're talking about. Why can't I serve as a deaconess?
Right, yeah.
My opinion is just as good as yours, and I think I could do a better job, and so forth.
And the truth is, it is clearly a product of our society.
Yeah.
I mean, it's where we are as a society, and you can deny that all day long. I mean, you can sit there and say, no, well, it's what the text says, and we could debate that. But the bottom line is we have a society where the role of women is not, God's standard for the role of women is not respected by the majority.
Right.
But then again, what is?
Well, I think it's a fair point to say that any local member of a congregation can be a servant, let's word it like that, can serve the church.
They better be.
Okay. Yeah. And then you got Bible class teachers, you've got people who mow the lawn, you've got people who volunteer to do things or are asked to do things if they have certain skill sets and everything. But what Paul is dealing with the office of a deacon is something more than just one person being asked to carry a letter from one congregation to another congregation.
Yeah, there is an element of authority attached to. That's the point.
Yeah.
The office of deacon. I mean, I preached on this several years ago, and I made the mistake of actually saying that there's not really an office of deacon. I recanted that after the invitation song. I mean,
after the tomatoes were thrown.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and I had elders come up to me and say, I was going to come talk to you about that. I mean, I got to thinking about it. I mean, it's an office. I mean, you cannot deny 1 Timothy 3. It's an office.
Yeah.
And there's authority attached to it, but not authority in the way that elders have authority.
Well, the fact that as we'll look at this here as we get to the study, but the deacon is to have his own family under control.
Yeah.
There's a reason for that, Yeah,
he's demonstrated the ability to rule.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that and I know this kind of leads into our conversation, but I think the thing about the deacon is that too often the church looks at that as a non-spiritual role. It just needs to be the guy that mows the lawn or things like that. And you're right. You're right. I mean, the whole concept of stewardship. And again, I think I told you guys last week, I see this as the peacemaker. I think that the deacon is the guy that ensures there's peace in the congregation because he's making sure nobody, and I go back to Acts 6 and the widows, and I say, look, that's what these guys were appointed to do, to make sure that it was all fair and that the body was being treated equally. They were keeping the peace, basically. They were like the sheriff's deputies, that they were making sure everything was going smoothly and being taken care of. And it requires an absolute spiritual ability to be charged with this responsibility. I mean, stewardship is, and that's what it is. It's a stewardship. You're basically, taking the elements of the church under that care.
Yeah. Right. That's right.
I know you want to get started. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, here we're discussing what we're going to discuss in a few minutes.
That's what we do. We talk about what we're going to talk about. We talk about it, and then next week we talk about it again.
Yeah,
we talk about what we
talked about. Yeah, we talk about what we talked about. So.
Yep. And it's a good preacher.
Isn't that what Keeble said? I heard Marshall Keeble said, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to say, then I'm going to say it, and then I'm going to tell you what I said.
I knew a preacher years ago when I was growing up. One of the complaints was he kind of re-preached the sermon in the conclusion.
Yeah.
He stepped down front. He was done with the sermon, but he went back through, and you'd spend another 15 minutes again on it. So,
Right. Well, did you get it the first time?
I was a kid. I don't remember. Anyway. All right, let's go ahead and we're going to fade out, start recording, and we will be right back. Stay tuned. Greetings. Welcome back to another Truth Factor discussion. We apologize for last week. It was a non-study study. I had a local visitor here, and he had some Bible questions, and they were good questions, and it got into start time and then past start time, and the guys were having a good discussion. But by the time I got back here, we decided just to let that be its own little discussion, and we would officially continue our study today. And so that's what we're going to be doing here, picking up in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 6. We've been sitting here with counting last week, for 3 weeks now? Actually, I was gone 2 weeks ago due to a wedding. So, but I think what it is that we're dealing with things that we have problems with, not being puffed up with pride. And that's really hitting to the heart of us. And so we really want to sit on that for a long time. All right. Let's see. We've got a number with us today who have joined in the chat session. Good to have you with us. We really appreciate your interest in spiritual matters. If you have any thoughts or comments, share them in the comment section, whether you're on Facebook, our Facebook page, or our YouTube channel. You can also send it to us via email, questions@truthfactor.com, or you can email us individually, as you see on the screen there, John at, Paul at, etc. Tom is the only odd one. We have him Tom at truthfactor.com, not Thomas, so. But we're his friends, so we get to call him that.
Well, I have doubts. I have doubts as you say it that way.
Okay. All right.
So if it's doubting Thomas, does that mean it's doubt Tom? Never mind.
It's not a good start. It's not a good start.
So just to clarify this, my boys, a few years ago, they said to me, if you think you're going to say something that's funny, don't.
Since when have we listened to stuff like that?
Exactly. So
yeah.
On to the study.
So today we are continuing in our study of 1 Timothy. I always forget to throw up this overlay. So there it is. I spent a lot of time on that. So we are studying through 1 Timothy. Let's turn it off now. All right. Let's back up, not for discussion, but context real quick. Let's go back to the beginning of chapter 3, and let's just read 1 through 7. We've got a few more thoughts to make on verses 6 and 7, and then we'll get into the discussion regarding deacons. So I'll go ahead and read that real quick, starting there in 1 Timothy chapter 3. Let's start in verse 1. There we go. This is a faithful saying. If a man desires the position of a bishop, he desires a good work. A bishop then must be blameless, the husband of one wife, temperate, sober-minded, of good behavior, hospitable, able to teach, not given to wine, not violent, not greedy for money, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not covetous, one who rules his own house well, having his children in submission with all reverence. For if a man does not know how to rule his own house, how will he take care of the church of God? Not a novice, lest being puffed up with pride, he fall into the same condemnation as the devil. Moreover, he must have a good testimony among those who are outside, lest he fall into reproach and the snare of the devil. So the idea of a novice, your Bibles will probably have a handy-dandy little footnote there that points toward the idea of a new convert. Do you think that would be an accurate representation of that? When he says not a novice, not someone who is a new convert? Okay. I would think so too. The issue of lest being puffed up with pride, he fall into the same condemnation as the devil. When you're doing a study about the devil, that's a very interesting statement because Paul identifies what the problem of the devil, what his problem was. And that was effectively pride, the way that Paul kind of explains it here. And we can fall to the same temptation, especially if we are not equipped with wisdom experience, knowledge, and so forth. But any thoughts?
Yeah.
I'll just throw out real quick that
Yeah.
it could be the condemnation of the devil too. It may not be that that the devil was condemned for the same sin, but that the devil condemns him. It's kind of interesting that it's used twice. It's the snare of the devil and the condemnation of the devil that are used in the next verse.
Oh,
so kind
as
of
in a trap. As in a trap, not so much the same sin as the devil, but it's a trap laid by the devil. That's reasonable. Yeah.
Yeah, and also just briefly, touching on that, not a novice, obviously the concept of being, and I think this turns into the word elder. The whole premise of the elder is somebody who is older and has established themselves. If somebody is a novice in the faith, and by the way, that doesn't just, there's no time frame on that, as in, even though obviously there is a time frame up front. But there's not really a time frame from that standpoint. But the idea of if somebody is a novice in the faith and yet they want to step into the position of an elder, they have a pride problem. Just by the fact that they're looking to rule and they're not humble enough to admit, I don't need to be in this position yet. So I look at it from that standpoint.
That's a good point. That's a very good way of looking at that. Any thoughts?
I think as you go through the qualifications, you see that the age is part of the requirement. Obviously, if you're going to have believing children, if you're going to have, shown yourself as a good leader of your household, all those things take time. And, as a new convert, it's going to take you time to show those things to be true, to bear out that fruit.
But what if you have an individual who is older in age, has been married for a while and has children and everything, but he becomes a Christian later in life, and a couple years later he decides, I can serve?
Well, you see that, in today's day and age, I guess our best example would be somebody maybe comes out of institutionalism. They studied their way out of it and they come over, and you see that they have wisdom in the scriptures. They understand, Bible authority, and you bring them, after a year or two, if you trust them, you would give them that position. We had a brother like that in churches I've been a part of, that they showed themselves worthy. Not that we saw them, grow up and go through some of these things, but
sure,
after you know somebody for a couple of years, you get to know people, you can understand, hey, they fit all these qualifications.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just don't bring in John, Acts 13 into the discussion yet.
I was going to say, you mean 14? Yeah.
Acts 14.
Acts 14:23, when they appointed elders. And I think we talked a little bit about this last week. From this standpoint of obviously they had not been Christians that long, but obviously the men that were qualified, they had been faithful Jews or maybe Gentiles, but they had proven they had proven their character by looking at their families. And what I would say with somebody like that, like Caleb gives the example of somebody coming out of institutionalism or something like that. How does he interact with his children? It's possible for a father to have good qualities as a father and faithfully raising his children, based upon his understanding of God's word. And you're going to see that in the response of the children to one who obeys the gospel. And how does he react to how the children respond? So that would be my thoughts with that. But even with that, there needs to be a period of time. At least the 2 to 3 years was mentioned from that standpoint, because think about somebody who has been serving as an elder faithfully in a congregation, and then they move for whatever reason. They move to another area. Are you going to automatically appoint them as an elder in the new congregation? Oh, here, he's qualified, or does there need to be a length of time attached, number one, for him to prove himself, and such things?
Well,
I think that's spared out in anybody that comes in.
Yeah,
your job,
exactly.
is to watch over the flock and make sure they're not a wolf in sheep's clothing. So there is a time period that's unspecified.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And the flock needs to know the shepherd, and the shepherd needs to know the flock. And that doesn't happen by just walking in and say, oh, well, I've got the qualifications. So I'm going to start serving now, and I'll figure you all out later.
Okay. All right. Then verse 7, moreover, he must have a good testimony among those who are outside, lest he fall into reproach and the snare of the devil. Any thoughts?
Probably just that.
Yeah.
Wait,
no, sorry. I was just going to say that's pretty straightforward. I mean, you have to have a reputation outside. Yeah, and we probably all have a story. We all have a story about somebody whose reputation in the community was not what it ought to be, and that reflected on the church. And I've heard of circumstances where a preacher would come into town for a gospel meeting, go to a barber shop or something like that, and invite people there, and they would ask the question, "Is that where so and so attends?" Or is that he's serving as an elder there, and he ripped me off in business, or something to that, or he's not honorable in his business dealings and stuff like that. I'll never darken the door of that congregation. So you've got illustrations like that. So he has to be respected in the community. And by the way, that doesn't mean everybody in the community loves you, because if you've got a community that is godless and hates the righteous, it might be the fact that he's despised by the wicked is what qualifies him, to serve. The fact that he's willing to stand up.
Yeah, Brian? Mm-hmm.
Well, I will say that, and one thing about good testimony is that the testimony of the outsiders isn't so much from their perspective. It's just that they would reflect that he has righteous character. Zacchaeus would have a good testimony among outsiders, even though nobody liked him, even though he probably was a man that, nobody, because of his profession, nobody trusted or cared for, but he still had a good reputation and a good standing among people. I think what's tricky is that, like I said, if an elder was an IRS agent, nobody in the outside likes him, but, he might still be testified. Well, he's honest. Well, he's forthright. He's, there are characteristics they'll still testify about. I think it's interesting because this is one of the few things where you say, we have to step outside of the church into the world to find out whether or not this person's qualified. That's kind of a neat thing to think about, to say, and I want to be careful to say, I don't think that we're being called to be police to say, well, let's do an investigation. We're going to find out what this guy, we're going to interview all of his neighbors and such. I don't know. Maybe some of you might feel differently, that maybe we are obligated to go that far, but I think it's more the idea in general. What do we know about this person standing among the world? And you can, like I said, you can generally know that without having to investigate much.
Well, nowadays with flock cameras and ring cameras and all that other stuff, you pay the right people and you'll get a good dossier. But I really wonder, especially this statement, if you go back to the first century, if we understand those times, everyone, if not everyone of a congregation, lived in the same walled city. I doubt very seriously someone would travel 10 miles, whatever, back then just to go to services in Jerusalem on Sunday morning and then turn around and head back to Jericho, depending on how far Jericho was away. So in a very smaller setting like that, I think it would be much more obvious if someone didn't have a good testimony, possibly.
Well, I think the good example today is, you just look on somebody's Facebook and see how well they're respected. And,
now you're
not to disparage anybody, but, you have members that you're like, I really don't want you out there, trying to proclaim the gospel, because I don't want people to know that you're associated with us. And if you feel that way about somebody that's trying to be an elder, then that's probably not a great place to be. You know, it matters how you act and what you put forth. And that's really what we're talking about. You know, how do you treat other people and how do people see you?
Well, this goes back to what we said at the kind of the beginning of this study on elders. The majority of these qualifications belong in the life of every Christian. You know, these aren't just some exceptionally super spiritual men. These are basically faithful Christians who there are certain qualifications that are very peculiar to them. The concept of apt to teach or to rebuke the gainsayer or the husband of one wife. Even having his children in submission is a requirement of all parents. You know, so the point you're trying to make is we don't just apply this to elders, but all the members of the congregation should be of a good testimony outside in the world.
Yeah. Absolutely. We're supposed to be the lights of the world and the salt of the earth.
Not dim wits, but lights.
Right.
Did it dim? Anyway. Okay. Let's get back on task with the question from Lori. Lori decided to ask us a question here. And it's a good question. She says, are there qualifications for a preacher? And if he's going through marital issues, should he step down? Now, I will say, Tom, that I don't think Lori's talking about you.
Yeah, and for those who wonder, Lori's a member here.
Exactly.
that you know, for those.
I was like, man, how did Tom get sideswiped?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and therefore, let me. You know what? Brian's got his hand. I'm gonna let Brian answer that, but then I might have a comment depending on what he says. But
I like to lead off on this question a lot because, and I appreciate Tom letting me, because I feel very strongly that it's oftentimes misunderstood that evangelists, preachers do have qualifications in the scripture. And if somebody says, where are they at? I might start off in 2 Timothy chapter 2, where Paul tells Timothy, a man of God, talking to Timothy, must be, and he goes through a series of qualifications that sound a lot like some of the qualifications we're reading right now. He says, the servant of the Lord must not quarrel, must be gentle all, must be apt to teach, must be patient. You have, several things there. One reason that we're not as good about catching the idea that evangelists have qualifications is that the letters that have the qualifications to elders and deacons are written to evangelists. So a lot of the qualifications are actually interwoven into that. So Paul, for example, would write to Titus and say, Titus, you need to be, well, in that language, he's talking to an evangelist. He says, you need to be sound in doctrine, sound in speech. He'll say, and really what I usually say is that he'll say several times, like in Titus 2:7, in all things show yourself a pattern of good works in doctrine, integrity, reverence, incorruptibility, sound speech that cannot be condemned. He tells Timothy mostly the same thing in 1 Timothy chapter 4. And I say, here are more qualifications that an evangelist must have. So Lori, I would say to your question, what about a man who's going through a marital problem? Well, it doesn't say that an evangelist has to be married. And we even have an example with Paul, who seemingly was not married. But the evangelist is supposed to be a model of what a godly marriage is. So if there is a marital issue that is because somebody is not the model of what they're supposed to be in marriage, then there might be an issue of qualification. Now that's not saying, that even that has to be qualified to say he's not being the model of godliness. We talked about our brother who recently passed away that who was not married, and he was divorced, but he himself was the model of what a man is supposed to be in that circumstance. So and I'm talking, of course, about Bob. That in that sense he fulfilled that qualification because he was the model of what a person is supposed to be in that situation. So I hope, Lori, that kind of helps. And Tom, thanks for letting me go ahead of you, Tom. But please go on.
Yeah, and I don't have a whole lot to add to that. The only thing I would add, and I think Brian would agree with me on this, is you have to weigh the circumstances. Define marital problems. There could be marital issues for a lot of different reasons. So it's something that would have to be taken. It has to be taken scenario by scenario because whatever's going on because I mean, it's unreasonable to demand of a preacher that he automatically step down right now, walk away from his responsibilities to provide when he may not be at fault at all. So I would say there's something to be said about investigating and those types of things. But anyways, and that is my thoughts on that. So, but I do agree with what Brian is saying. I mean, it's very possible that marital issues could become a distraction. And if they are going to be a distraction, then that has to be factored in.
Well, I don't disagree with that. But look at it this way too: is a preacher a member of the local congregation? You know, sometimes preachers are viewed as a hired person, and so they are just still outside the boundaries of the family, if you would. And so if he does something wrong or cheats on his wife or, you know, makes some horrible bad decision in public and everything, and he brings reproach on the church, well, it's easy to kind of get rid of him, because all you got to do is say, we don't need you anymore. You go find another congregation to preach for. But if a preacher is a member of a congregation, then how would you deal with other members who are going through the same problem? You know, and sorry, my phone is ringing. It's distracting me here. I'm ignoring it. Not really, because I just said something about it. But let's talk about it from the preacher standpoint. I have known I should say it that way. I've known a number of preachers that who have cheated on their wives. And that does pretty much create a ripple within the congregation that I don't know if they ever recover from. I think there's always a scar there. Even if they work it out with the congregation, that affair will become public to the congregation, whether he chooses to admit it or through word of mouth or what have you. And so then you've got harm to the local congregation. What is he going to choose to do? Does he choose to stay there? If the congregation says, we want you to stay here, he's got to question his effectiveness. Now, when I preach on the home, will they say, yeah, this applies to everyone but you? You know, there's so many different things there. But as far as the congregation, I agree with y'all. It doesn't disqualify a preacher as long as he's doing his work. All right, but now what's his step? There's marital trouble that's caused, it's his fault or the fault of the wife, and I've jumped to the marital problem of adultery, but there could be other marital issues that come up to that point. Most of those things are workable. I should say all of them should be workable, but the thing that would disqualify a preacher goes back to what Brian's talking about. If he doesn't preach the word, you know, if he is a quarreler, if he goes against the things that Paul's telling Timothy here, then these things, you know, he's doing harm to the congregation. But now I'm rambling at that point. But any thoughts?
Well, I always think of James chapter 3 and verse 1.
Okay.
Because James brings up a really good point about anybody who wants to be a teacher. He says, let not many of you become teachers, my brethren, knowing that as such you will incur a stricter judgment. For we all stumble in many ways, and if anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body as well. So we got to be careful about wanting to teach and teaching, because you're going to incur a stricter judgment. And that's not just preachers. That's anybody that teaches. So we got to be careful about what we say and what we do, because we're under a stricter judgment. And people are going to judge those things. You know, how can you listen to somebody say something, you know, listen to what I say, not what I do? That doesn't really work.
That's the Pharisees.
Go ahead, John. Yeah, that's exactly right. So, you know, Tom brings up a good point. Well, it depends on the nature of the issue, whether he should step down or not. Is it a private struggle that he's having with his wife? You know, marriage problems happen. Or is this, you know, a public disqualification that's going to affect his ability to convince people and for them to listen? Or does it become a distraction? And if it becomes a distraction, then I think everybody can agree, you know, maybe you should take a step back, let the other men preach for a while. You know, let this, you know.
Yeah, and you've also got the issue of how long.
Right. And that's a case-by-case basis. Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, exactly. And that's my point. how long is
Yeah.
it going on? So,
Right.
Hey,
Brian, you got something?
You're muted. Everything you're saying is so
voice.
great.
It was incredible. Best stuff I ever said. I really want to go back to what John said, because I think that's super important, that the idea that, as John said, the preacher should be seen as a member of the church and not as a hireling. I think it's such a terrible way and I think it comes out of denominationalism. I think it's perpetuated by institutionalism. I was ashamed to say I was looking at church ads for institutional churches today for hiring preachers, and I was just blown away. Yeah, I know. I'm not looking, but I was just blown away by how secular they seemed. How much it was clearly just like any job hiring. It just didn't. There was nothing spiritual in many of the. I mean, a few were good, but the point was they weren't looking for people that were qualified for a spiritual work. They were looking for people that checked off boxes. And like John said, it seems like a lot of times the church's motto is, well, if he's not fulfilling the work of the evangelist, it's time for him to go. As opposed to, like, if a man were an elder and he says, I'm really struggling with the work of an elder right now, so I'll step aside for a bit. And we should all say, be very comforting and say, that's really hard, and we want to help you, whatever your struggle is, and we want to get you back into that work qualified again. That should be how we look at an evangelist, but unfortunately, it's not. It's and I think we all can appreciate that like I said, that's probably a result of institutional and denominational thinking. But they just look at the preacher as the guy that comes and goes, and not that he's supposed to be a part of the congregation, that he's supposed to be, if the preacher says, hey, I'm not going to be a preacher anymore, it should be understood by everybody, okay, well, he's going to be, but he'll stay in the congregation because he's still a member, or maybe he is moving. But the point is, the expectation is just like, if a deacon said, I can't be a deacon anymore, well, okay, you'll be, but you'll still be here, and we'll, we still have a relationship with you. That it's just unfortunate that the preacher has become a hireling in many circumstances and is treated as such. And that's regrettable. And again, I think a big reason for that is that we don't look at the work of a preacher as a qualified office. We look at it as a hired position. And if we looked at it as a qualified office, we would see it more from a perspective of, hey, men from among us could fulfill that role. We could draw a man from among us to become our evangelist, and by the way, I'm not saying, and this is a dangerous thing too, to say just because a guy preaches every Sunday, he's the preacher. The work of a preacher is an office. It's not just that he preaches once in a while. It'd be like saying, right now we don't have elders, but sometimes men make decisions that elders would make, Doesn't mean that we're elders. It means that we're just making decisions elders would normally make. Somebody preaches on Sundays, they're not the preacher. The preacher is an office in the church. It is not just the guy that stands up in front. So it's just, like I said, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about this. And that's why I really appreciated Lori's question, because it is something I like talking about and making a point about.
That's a good point.
Yeah. Well, it goes back to Galatians 6 and verse 1 and 2. What do you do when somebody trespasses? That's a member. If the preacher's a member, then you restore such a one if he's caught in any trespass. And you are a spiritual restorer. So the goal is to restore. So oftentimes it's like, well, he messed up, fire him, get rid of him. He's somebody else's problem. And that's not looking out for somebody's soul. Preachers has souls too. We have just as many problems as everybody else. And we need support and help from brethren that are spiritual.
But it's hard for preachers to admit that.
Yeah.
It's hard for a preacher to go down front and meet himself. I say that a little bit tongue in cheek. That's what my wife says. You need to go down front and meet yourself. But the idea of a preacher stepping forward and saying, I need your prayers because I've got a problem, that's hard to do.
And it's hard to do because the way people treat the preacher is like he's like the Pope. He's like holier than thou. And if the preacher's not holier than thou, then I can't worship there.
Yeah.
It's like, well, I got news for you. We got problems too.
That's right.
And I think, to Brian's point, it's so important for people to see the preacher as part of the congregation. It's also important for preachers to realize that they're part of the congregation. And I think some preachers separate themselves and they never truly join themselves to the local work.
And the congregation feels that.
Yeah. And if they're off doing gospel meetings all the time, they're gone all the time, or they're there on Sunday and Wednesday, but they're gone the rest of the week because they got, other places to be.
Right.
then you're not really joining yourself to that local group and that local population.
Right. And sometimes, adding to that, a preacher has been hurt.
Yeah.
He has made himself vulnerable to a congregation, and they hurt him. And maybe it's happened a couple of times, so he's hesitant to open up to a congregation. But that you're not going to be effective if you don't. So I mean, so you have to work through that, and as brethren, we have to learn to trust each other. And by the way, that goes for preachers and elders too with their congregation. Until your congregation proves themselves to be untrustworthy, you need to trust them that they're going to try to.
Yeah.
They want to do. They love the Lord. They want to do the right thing, and you have to trust that until it's proven otherwise. And I think sometimes that's one of the things that leaders struggle with. As elders are shepherding a congregation, as a preacher is deciding what to preach, and as he's engaged in his work and so on.
Yeah. I've got a couple of them I want to bring into the discussion. There was something I was going to mention to say about what Tom was saying, but I looked down to see what we're saying in private and our own little messaging and got distracted. So it's your own fault now. So let's come back to Chris Kramer's comment. It's a little bit old now. It's got set out on the counter and it's kind of gotten a little bit stale. But I think it's a good comment, though. He says, a man's reputation is known over time. If you don't know the person who is being considered as a shepherd, then that does not qualify him for the flock. The church has qualifications they must meet. And that's a very good point. Hadn't really thought about it from that perspective, but that's a good point. Let me go ahead and bring in Jimmy's then, his first comment in this thread here, because it kind of touches it. There's a little bit of similarity here. Jimmy says, a public figure, the preacher doing something bad will cause much distress on the church. We often blame the color of the carpet, but I do think this happens more and causes a lot of division in the church. However, I think this applies to elders and deacons and anyone in the church that is under the public eye. Any thoughts about either of those two comments? All right. You got it. Silence is golden here. All right, but I think it's a good point. And, we don't talk about the church's qualifications or responsibility towards the elders. That's an interesting point. We do talk about it, but a lot of times greater emphasis is given to the qualification of the elders than the responsibility of the church to the elders.
Yeah. Well, that becomes a problem if you've never had elders and you have people that don't want to have elders because they got to give up their power and control. Because they have a voice. Every man has a voice when there's no elders. Yeah. And to give that up is hard for some people.
And they're probably not going to say, we don't need elders, because they know that would be unscriptural. But they create an atmosphere of expectation so high that no one qualifies.
Yeah. We can nitpick these things we've talked about in chapter 3 to death until nobody's qualified ever.
Exactly.
And that's not right either. So you got to be careful with that.
All right, let's see. Jimmy, he goes on to say, do you think we think this sometimes, now, Brian, this goes back to what you were saying, Brian. Do you think we think this because sometimes we think of church as a business? Yeah.
And I think that was Brian's point with looking at these ads for preachers, is that they've turned it into a business. It's all about marketing. It's not about worshiping God. It's not about coming and growing closer to God. It's about what can we do to get you to feel good about yourself, and we're trying to market to you. Yes.
Yeah, it's about numbers. It's about numbers.
It is 100%. That's a business.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. It's a business mind. It's numbers on the attendance, and it's numbers in the contribution.
That's it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Brian Paul.
And it's that. Well, if you can, he did. The problem as we start going through these, and we'll make it to deacons eventually, is they don't follow the plan that God has laid out for the church leadership.
Yeah.
So when you have a one-man pastor and he sins because he cheated on his wife, well, then everybody just close up shop. We're going to go down to the next megachurch down the street. We're going to go to the next place. Whereas if we sin, well, okay, John, maybe you need to take a step back from the pulpit. We'll let the elders preach for a couple months and let you figure your life out, and then you can come back and,
in the denominational world, they call it sabbaticals.
Right. But like what happens, like, sabbatical. Yeah, if they have a problem and it's big enough, well, by all means, they're going to, we'll just close up the doors and we're going to go down the street to the next church.
Yeah.
And that's not how the Lord intended the church to work.
No. I don't believe in the first century you had, unless you're going to take someone's going to take the position of home churches. I don't believe they had multiple congregations in cities in the first century. I think all the Christians, faithful Christians would come together in one location and worship. Nowadays, you could have members from all over the great Oklahoma City area, and drive in. That seemed relevant at the time. I don't know, was that relevant, Caleb, what you were just saying?
No, I think that's true. Well, you have to work out your problems with fear and trembling with the Lord.
That's it.
Instead of, I'm upset, I'm going to go down the street.
That's it. Thank
you.
Hey,
you guys are having problems. You need to go to this church and you need to go to that church, and you just separate.
Yeah.
Hey, I don't think that is the way we're supposed to handle it either.
What was it to the church in, it might have been Smyrna, but I'm thinking I've got it called wrong, where he said, some of you here have not yet soiled your garments. Okay. He didn't tell them, now you go start another congregation. He put the responsibility of fixing the problems on everyone, including those members too.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it doesn't say go start another group. Forget these people. They're messed up. You just go start your own church down the street. And that's exactly what we've turned it into.
Yeah.
We'll fire the preacher. Well, then he'll take 3 or 4 families and he'll go meet at his house. No, it's not how it should be.
No.
And we should do everything we can to make sure that doesn't happen.
But now when a preacher's livelihood depends on the congregation, then he's got to figure out what is he going to do once he's released. And sometimes you're right, they choose to start another congregation because now they were treated unjustly, or some will choose to move elsewhere.
Right.
And with good manners and spirits, if you want to keep doing that, then you move elsewhere. I mean, it's simple, I guess.
Yeah, and that lends to the problem with some preachers not having an ability to do anything else, or that's all they've ever done.
Yeah.
Where, if you're like Paul and you can make tents, then you have an ability to earn a living.
Yeah.
And you're not beholden to, well, if you teach, the truth, then we're going to get rid of you. Well, then how likely are you to, well, I just won't preach on that.
Exactly.
Where we should never put ourselves in that situation where I have to, compromise.
Yeah. And that launches a whole nother discussion that we won't have right now. But I think it's a good discussion. I really do. Jimmy, he says, preachers are no different than any other Christians. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. That's right. Paul groups all Gentiles and Jews together, and there's no reason to think that we don't face the same struggles and challenges. That's exactly right. One more question, comment coming in here, and then we will move on, time permitting. David Clark says, if the leadership struggles, the congregation struggles as well. It's a good point.
Yeah.
It's a very good point.
Well, if the preacher's having a problem, the church is not going to grow the way it should.
Yeah.
And there's going to be a setback. There's going to be problems.
Yeah.
And the same thing is true with elders and with deacons. Yeah, it's the same. It's the same with every public role.
Yeah. We do recognize scripturally preachers can move from congregation to congregation. We understand that, but we're still putting them as part of the family of the local group. It'd be no different than someone who's worshiped at a congregation for 10 years and then they have to move away because of their job. They go to another congregation. Yeah. Are any other thoughts on this previous discussion on preachers? The prior discussion on preachers have been brought to you by Lori. So, it's a very good question. Appreciate it, Lori. It's all part of this greater discussion or study through 1 Timothy. So, all right. Let's step into the next section here. Let's start in verse 8. And Brian, would you read for us verses 8 through 13? I think will probably be a good section.
All right, I'll be reading out of the New King James Version, verses 8 through 13. Likewise, deacons must be reverent, not double-tongued, not given to much wine, not greedy for money, holding the mystery of the faith with a pure conscience. But let these also be first tested, then let them serve as deacons, being found blameless. Likewise, their wives must be reverent, not slanderers, temperate, faithful in all things. Let deacons be the husbands of one wife, ruling their children and their own houses well. For those who have served well as deacons obtain for themselves a good standing and great boldness in the faith which is in Christ Jesus.
All right, thank you, sir. I already got a few questions I want to ask you, and they're towards the end of it, but I don't want to jump to the end before we talk about the beginning, so hopefully I'll remember it here. So the idea of deacons being reverent, what are your thoughts on that, Brian? Because it's a good start in the list here.
Well, verse 8 sounds a lot like qualifications we've already read, and that's probably why it's easy for us to want to move quickly through them. Reverent, holy, to be careful in the way that they behave. I think that's probably pretty straightforward. It's a conduct kind of statement saying, these need to be people that conduct themselves in a manner that's appropriate to the Christian calling. And as I said, I think a lot of these things, I think the only questionable thing is why is it worded slightly different for the consideration about wine with the elder and with the deacon. And I tend to say I don't think there really is much of a difference. I think it's just Paul says things different ways. I don't think there's necessarily meant to be much distinction in those things. I don't know if that's one of the questions you were thinking about there.
No, it's farther down, but that's a good guess there. The thought about reverence here real quick too. You mentioned conduct, and I think it's a very good point, but it also gets to the heart of the matter too. The individual in their worship to God, they're not just their worship, their attitude in regards to the Lord and his word and the responsibilities to the Lord, which would then translate into the church.
And I know I've made a big deal about the idea that the deacon is a steward of the members of the congregation in the way that he takes care of them. I actually think that's what verse 9 is kind of referring to a little bit. Although he will come back and he'll say that the mystery of godliness is verse 16, and he'll lay out like a typology of the gospel. I tend to think mystery of the gospel here could refer more to what he talks about like in Ephesians 3, where he says the mystery of the gospel is that God wanted the Jew and the Gentile reconciled in one body. And I think, again, it's that, that you hold the mystery with a pure conscience. To me, I kind of, again, this is my peacemaker language, where I think the deacon is the ultimate peacemaker. He looks at every brethren equally. He doesn't say, well, these are those brethren, these are the Jewish brethren, these are the Gentile brethren. And I like to, again, I see Acts chapter 6 as such a key definition in this, that you had this moment where maybe the native born were being treated better than others. A deacon has a pure conscience towards every member. He sees every member as a treasure. He sees every member as valuable. He sees, and this is the reverend, coming back to your question on reverend, he sees every member of the church as holy. So, he doesn't show a preference. He doesn't say, well, I like these brethren more than other brethren. He's gonna hold his office without any partiality. And I think that that's kind of what I like about verse 8 and 9, is that while, again, and Tom made the point, and I'm probably stealing Tom's thunder here to say, Tom makes the point that it starts off with likewise, which is telling us, just like with an elder, kind of statement, that does kind of reveal these are the same thoughts. But I do think that there's a sense where he wants to emphasize a deacon has to be a person. And again, maybe I am adding a little bit to it. Maybe I am, giving a little bit of my own spin. But I think he's saying it has to be without partiality. That's what he means to hold the mystery with a pure conscience. The mystery of the Jew and the Gentile reconciled as one. You've got to hold, can I say, racial disparity? Today we have different racial disparities in churches, differences in our demographics. And, that a deacon cannot have a bias. He has to look at every member as holy. So that's what
That's a good point. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, the only thing I'd build on the concept of that likewise is it's kind of interesting that the first phrase for deacons is reverent. Remember what the first one was for bishops? It was blameless. So I've heard it said, and I think there is definitely a degree to it. I don't think it stands by itself, but that first quality is going to regulate or dictate every other quality that's mentioned. Just like the elder being blameless, that applies to all the other ones. A deacon being reverent, that applies to everything else that is said about them. And of course, the idea of being reverent is you're dignified, you're respectful, especially toward God, as well as the work and so on. So it needs to be somebody that's dependable and has proven themselves. Again, this wouldn't be a novice either, or at least a complete novice.
Yeah. That's a good point.
Well, to back up Brian's point, I think you look at Acts chapter 6 when they appoint men as to be servants. They're making sure that there's nobody overlooked. There's no partiality. Everybody's going to get the same treatment. Now, are they talking about deacons there or not? People debate that, but it sure seems like, they're being put in special service, and that's what a deacon is. They're special servants.
Yeah. I mean, Acts 6 definitely gives an illustration. Whether they were deacons of the church in Jerusalem or not, or I mean, because you're dealing with the apostles, right. That's one of the things that and that's one of the things that makes the church at Jerusalem an exception. Or right. Exceptional, maybe not exception, but exceptional. Is the fact they had the apostles there, and it's the apostles that are giving these instructions, and these 7 men are going to serve the apostles in the same way that a deacon will serve the elders and the congregation.
Yeah, and you see that the church in Jerusalem does, in fact, have elders later, as Peter says, as a fellow elder. So we do see them organized the same way that Paul does the churches. So it's all one word. And things Paul's talking about, obviously they're also doing, as Peter mentions too.
Yeah, and you brought up something there, Caleb, about the word deacon. The word deacon in the Greek is actually the word diakonos, which is a word that means a servant. And the word is used multiple times throughout the New Testament. And most of the time, it's describing serving in one way, and there's not an office that's attached to it, as it is used in those texts. In our pre-show discussion, I made the point that clearly in 1 Timothy, this is an office. So I mean, as opposed to every Christian is to serve. I mean, period. I mean, we're actually discussing right now that in our Bible studies right now. We're going through Portraits of Discipleship, a book, and we're actually dealing with the lesson about servants. I mean, a disciple is a servant, period. Every Christian is to serve and to understand being servant. And it's this word, diakonos, in its various forms. But in this text and also in Philippians 1 and verse 1, those, to my knowledge, those are the only 2 passages where this word diakonos is specifically applying to an office.
Yeah. And they have to be one who executes the authority of another.
Yeah, exactly. Which is why they're trusted. Yeah.
Right. And that's why we say you can't have deacons without elders, because who are they?
Right.
Who are they answering to?
Yeah. And I firmly believe that you can't have deacons in a congregation without elders because they have an authority. I believe that the office of deacon is an authoritative position. Yeah. They've been given authority in a given area. Whatever their task is, is they've been given authority by the elders, not superseding the Bible, not superseding God. They're a Christian like everybody else, but they're in an office, and they're to be respected because of that office.
I got to clarify something. I was going to make a comment after Caleb, and I got 2 words out, not quite. And then Tom started speaking. So it sounded like I was about to disagree with what Caleb said.
That's exactly how I took it.
Yeah. What I was trying to say is that it's not quite the same as a type, anti-type, or a shadow or the real, but we could look at Acts 6 and the role of those 7 as kind of a shadow of the office of deacons that would be later established, as the apostles were in effect maybe a shadow of the elders. That may be stretching it. I realize that, but
I actually
to your
think that's pretty
point,
good.
yeah, and to your point, the church is about to be ravaged.
Yeah.
Not that long in the future. They don't organize, with elders and deacons until after that happens. Of course, a lot of those men are going to go out and spread the gospel. Like Stephen, he's going to get put to death. Philip's going to go teach in Samaria. So, those people are actually going to get spread out. They don't get to be special servants for long before they're spread throughout the kingdom.
But they'll take with them what they learned, too.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're almost out of time. I want to come back to Jimmy's point, or Jimmy made a comment just a moment ago, and he says, "Do not be drunken to wine. Deacons and members of the church like to use this verse for social drinking." And then he says this verse and many others, they'll use it. It says, "Don't be drunken to wine. So if I drink to the edge, I'm good." And I'll tell you, Jimmy, I struggle with anyone that wants to drink so much that they're looking for any passage to justify that type of habit. To me, it's not a discussion really about, is one drink okay? To me, I'm wondering what is behind that question. What's the motivation there? What's driving the person? So when he says not given to much wine, it shouldn't be viewed as, oh, I've got leeway to now drink to the point where I'm not drunk, whereas the elder, he can't do any of it. That's not the point.
And I think, Caleb, I'm sorry, cut you off.
No, go ahead, Brian.
He defers to the elderly, or to the elders.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Caleb.
Yeah.
I apologize. I completely cut you off, Caleb. I just wanted to say that really drove me to say, it's kind of frustrating. Somebody says, well, I remember a guy once said, well, I'm a preacher, and since I'm not an elder, I can drink. And I'm like, but the logic is to say, well, I'm not an elder, so I can be violent. I can be greedy for money. I can be self-willed, or, it was just really absurd. And I think what the point is that an elder has nothing to do with wine. A deacon has nothing to do with wine. A Christian has nothing to do with wine. And it's not saying, well, if you decide not to be an elder, you can have something to do with wine. More than it's saying, well, if you're not an elder, you can be violent. You can be. The point is you're showing the virtues of Christ, and one of the virtues of Christ is we have nothing to do with wine. I mean, it's just the concept here. And of course, we know that in the first century it is a little different than the use of those words and such. And I got to be careful to say, we always consider that. But the point is, there isn't a statement here where he's saying, well, here's the standard. So if you're not an elder, you're okay to break that standard. These are all principles that are salvation issues. If I'm not blameless, if I'm not, if I don't love what's good, if I'm not self-controlled, I mean, these are all things that can cost me my soul. So for somebody, to go into Jimmy's point, it's just really frustrating. Caleb, I'm sorry. I apologize completely again. I jumped in over you, and please give us your wisdom. Let the best be for last.
No, you're fine. The thing I was going to say is I always go back to the heart of the matter, which is really what John was saying. Where's your heart at? Is your heart to serve God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength? Or is my heart to, well, how far can I push this to the line? How close to the cliff edge can I get? Well, then your mind's not right. You're not serving God in the right manner. And that's what you have to ask yourself. And the same thing is true with sexual immorality, with being modest, with nakedness. All those things come down to, where's your heart at? Is your heart looking out for what God wants you to do and looking out for your neighbor's best interest, or are you just doing what you want to do and as close as I can get to the line?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I know this, we could go way off topic on this, but it was mentioned, social drinking. Just understand, social drinking today compared to what was being dealt with in the first century, it's apples and oranges. I mean, it's two totally different fruits, and I mean, which is why I struggle with the concept of, so when I say I struggle, I think it's wrong. I just think that social drinking is not needed today. There's no reason that you can give me that says it's a good thing. I mean, if you can argue the one beer, whatever, I don't want to go there. I mean, yeah. And when I say I don't want to go there, I'm not going to justify that. I will not say that is acceptable, because it's just not. It is not needed today, and it's just not associated with godliness.
Yeah, exactly, and that would be a good study at a later point. Because you bring in 1 Peter chapter 4 and the use of the term banquetings in the King James translation.
Yeah. The three terms there. So.
And this is, make one more comment, then we'll start winding it up here real quick. But isn't our service unto God all about, or at least contingent upon, self-control? When you think about Paul says, I will not be brought under the power of any. Now, he's talking about, things, all things are lawful, but not all things are expedient. But I like that phrase there. I will not be brought under the power of any. And there are so many things in the world that tries to bring us under their power. And alcohol is just one of those. And so, all right. Any other thoughts or comments? I did want to say, and I joke a little too much, I know that, but I've known a lot of brethren who are given to wine. They whine about this, they whine about that. All right. And David makes a good comment, or Dave in the comment in chat room. He says people rarely stick to just one drink. And that's kind of the problem. This is not something people say, well, I like to be able to do it once a year at holidays. They take what they seem to be a very isolated event that's very controlled and say, I want to be justified for that. But the majority of times it doesn't really, it's not limited to that moment, to that instance. It's not just one. Many times it leads to a habit, to an issue, to a life choice, to a practice, just, so many things.
Right. Well, maybe I'm ignorant about it, but if you argue I just like to do it once a year, it's going to have an even greater effect on you because your body is not used to it at all. So, but that's a.
So you should do it more frequently so it doesn't affect your body as much, is what you're saying.
My point is somebody that's making that argument.
I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we'll get into it later, when he brings up telling Timothy to use a little wine for your stomach. And I've known people, that's how they were told, that's what they were taught. And then they end up being an alcoholic because somebody told them that.
Yeah.
So we got to be careful, It is a dangerous thing to play with.
Yeah, it is. Just look at the evidence.
Yeah.
I mean, just look through history.
And we have an abundance. Yeah, we have an abundance at our point in history that we can look back on.
What is the Bible? First time we meet wine, what happens with Noah? Last time we meet wine, it's the harlot of Babylon. I mean, it's not something the Bible loves to tie to good things.
That's right. Yeah. That's a good way of looking at it. Okay. Well, I'll tell you what, let's plan to pause the study here for this week. Let's continue now that we are in our discussion of deacons. Let's start with verse 10. A few things we want to just briefly talk about. First, being tested, talking about their wives, or wives, depending on how you want to look at it. We'll get into that next week. We'll talk about the requirements being a husband of one wife and ruling their children and household well. Brian, that's my question I want to bring up. We'll look at it next week, verse 12. He talks about ruling their children and their own houses well. Kind of two statements there. So what else is included in their own houses? When he makes that statement there. And So I thought it was, something we can look at next week. All right.
Plurality of houses? Now that's something.
No, no, children, and then he mentions his house.
Yeah. I know. That's what John is saying. John is saying deacons have to have more than one house.
Yeah. I mean, they got to be landlords.
Just like more than one children. There you go.
Right.
If a deacon can
think of equality,
yeah. If a deacon must have more than one child, then he must have more than one house. There's the answer. Yep. Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, we've come up real close to the edge. We slammed on the brakes and we slid just a little bit off. So we'll back up and we'll continue our study next week. Appreciate everyone. Appreciate, guys, your comments. Really appreciate everything you said. And you at home who've joined us for the study, thank you so much. We really appreciate your interest in spiritual matters. We are always open to questions. Even if you disagree with us, let us know. That's perfectly fine. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to study together. You can send them to questions@truthfactor.com or reach out to us individually if you would like to do that. Tom at, Paul at, Brendan at truthfactor.com. We're all there. All right. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll continue this, Lord willing, next Thursday at 11 o'clock a.m. Central Time, picking up in 1 Timothy chapter 3, there in verse 10. You have a wonderful week. Bye-bye.